So this opera was written in 1887, 125 years ago, and before 1850, Italian opera, in Italy in particular, was really the only show in town. There were no foreign operas. Italy had this really solid tradition of operas, and it exported them all over the world. But increasingly in the second half of the 19th century, Italy becomes more international musically, and foreign operas begin to enter into the repertory there for the first time. And Verdi, although he himself became international, and Aida, La Forza del Destino, Don Carlos, all those operas written for foreign theatres, he became international, but he hated what was happening in Italy. He hated the kind of dilution of this Italianness. But then in 1879, at the end of the 1870s, he's 66 years old, this young man, 30 years younger than Verdi, Boito, got together and tempted him back into operatic composition to write Otello. Now, how did this happen? Why did he choose Otello? Obviously, Shakespeare was important. Shakespeare is someone who had obsessed Verdi through much of his life. Shakespeare being not an Elizabethan playwright, but an honorary romantic, in all sorts of ways. He was recreated by the Romantics. So that was obviously important. But I think one thing that's really, and it can be overstressed, I think, the Shakespeare. The other thing about this opera, which is tremendously important, that it's a very tightly constructed, it's a very simple plot. You could all say what the plot of Otello is in one sentence, okay? Try doing that for Don Carlos or Trovatore. It's very simple. It's got a classic triangle of a soprano and a tenor and a baritone, and it's got a very strong line through it. In other words, it's not that kind of patchwork that he was worried about. It's got a very, very condensed plot. And that's one thing, obviously, that he liked about it. The interesting thing about his collaboration with Boito, this is a man who's much, much younger, and they'd had their difficult times in all sorts of ways because they came from different generations. The interesting thing about their collaboration, Verdi in early life had been a perfect tyrant with librettists. He'd just bully them into doing exactly what he wanted. And now he's the most famous, he's tremendously famous. But the strange thing is that Boito ends up dictating to him what Otello is going to be like. There's a very interesting moment just at the beginning of their collaboration where it's about the Act 3 finale, where Otello strikes Desdemona to the ground, and there's a sort of a horrified reaction to this. And Verdi, at the beginning, has a great idea for what's going to happen next. So everyone's sort of stunned, and they sing this concitato, and then Verdi says, look, what we should do then is you hear a trumpet in the distance, and then people say, the Turks have come back. They're invading again. And Otello, who's at the kind of bottom of his kind of dignity, having struck his wife in public, suddenly raises himself up and says, right guys, let's go and defend the city, and rushes off like Manrico in Il Trovatore. And that's the end of that. That was what he asked Boito to do. And Boito wrote back and said, dear Giuseppe, no. This is not going to work. And he says this, it's very interesting what he says. He says, Otello is a man moving in a nightmare. If we conceive of an event that must necessarily arouse and distract Otello, then we destroy the sinister spell that Shakespeare created. That attack of the Turks seems to me like a fist breaking the window of a room where two people are about to die of asphyxiation. That's what Boito says. It's very modern. It sounds like he's got a kind of idea of an Ibsen-like, drama here. Verdi is playing out the kind of music he used to write earlier. That would be a classic way to finish, an act at the time of Il Trovatore. But Boito, very patiently, drew Verdi into this different way of writing, very different kind of way of thinking. So Boito's influence is enormously important in this opera in all sorts of ways. The strange thing is, Verdi is so famous at this time, but this libretto is one about which he was most passive in his life. Virtually all of Boito's ideas were accepted by Verdi. Never happened before. And the extreme case of this is his last opera, Falstaff, where Boito just wrote the libretto, gave it to him, Verdi said thank you very much and set it from beginning to end. It had nothing to do with the libretto at all. But another way that Verdi constructed this opera, which I think is really interesting, is about how the three main characters, Desdemona and Iago and Otello, we've heard about this, are all fundamentally different, okay? They're different, you know, one's a black man and one's a white woman and one's a villain. They're different in that way, but their modes of expressing themselves musically are also utterly different. And Verdi had an interesting thing to say about this. He talked about this in a letter to someone who wanted to produce the opera, and here's how he described the three. He said, Desdemona is a part in which the thread, the melodic line, never ceases from the first note to the last, right? All Desdemona ever does is sing. She has no recitative, no declamation or anything like that. And you saw that. So really we heard soprano sing there. That thing that we heard her sing at the beginning, Mio superbo guerrier, my proud warrior, that is the first thing she sings in the opera. And it's a lyrical line. There's no warm-up. Nothing happens to her just gently letting you in. She sings from beginning to an end. So she's a kind of ideal type, if you want. Just as Iago has only to declaim and laugh mockingly. So basically what Iago does, his basic mode of discourse is recitative and declamation. His basic way of expressing himself is the thing that Desdemona never does. And then the interesting thing, so you've got these two sort of opposites, if you want, pulling them. One is beautiful melody and the other is declamation, okay? Iago, Desdemona. And what happens just as, and then he says, Otello, now the warrior, now the passionate lover, now crushed, now ferocious, must sing and howl, right? So what Otello is, his musical discourse is forever oscillating between those two. He's torn between these two modes, if you want, of musical discourse. He's torn between the beauty of Desdemona on the one hand and this kind of angry, slippery declamation of Iago on the other. So there's a sense in which there's a musical battle going on among these three characters. But I think there's another kind of interesting way that we can think about that, because, well, if you think about it in terms of the development of Italian opera, then beautiful singing is what used to happen in the old days when everything was happy in Verdi's world. Bel canto, it's called, beautiful singing. And that's what Desdemona does from beginning to end. The modern opera is Iago, right? It's slippery, it's declamation, it's Wagner, yeah? It's that new stuff. And then Otello is caught between these two musical styles. So there's one sense in which why Otello, I think, was so attractive to Verdi in some ways is that he could play out his concerns about the history of opera. It's almost that Otello in some ways is an opera about the problem of opera at that time, the problem of whether it should be beautiful music or whether it should be astounding drama and so on. All sorts of ways in which I think that Verdi, towards the end of his life, became more and more a political composer in all sorts of ways. He wanted to make a point. He wanted to make a point about the state of opera, so he did it through this opera. I think there's one thing I would say that's interesting, a sort of interesting document which people don't know about very much, but Verdi, towards the end of his life, became obsessed with staging. And there's a production book of Otello, which is, it's so-called Disposizione Scenica in Italian. It's a kind of, it's a thick book of about 80 pages, which says exactly what every character should wear and do and stand all the way through the opera. It's almost like a kind of verbal video of how the opera was first performed. And it explicitly has Verdi's sort of stamp of approval. It says at the beginning, this is the way that we first produced this opera at La Scala, and every other production must do exactly the same as this. Now, that hasn't happened, as you know. But it's interesting, I just wonder whether we'd want it to happen. You know, would we want I'm sure a lot of you have spent some time in the Opera House incandescent with anger about, you know, men on tricycles, you know, coming in or whatever. But I think, you know, you do have to think about whether we would want the opera produced that way. Exactly the same every time. And one of the interesting things about this, as far as Verdi is concerned, is that it's clear from looking at this Disposizione Scenica, this production book, that he was very conservative about the way he wanted people to act. He wanted them to act in a rather old-fashioned style, much more like the 1850s than the 1880s, where a kind of much more modern acting, sort of realist acting was coming in. He didn't like that, so he wanted people to perform in an old-fashioned way, because that was his taste. So in other words, you're again left with this thing. If you wanted to imitate the first production of Otello, you'd have to make it in a deliberately old-fashioned style of acting, you know. So what would old-fashioned mean for us? I mean, once you start to think about whether you'd reproduce this work scenically according to this book, you'd have to think about whether you wanted to reproduce the spirit of it or the letter of it, you know. It's those legal arguments which go on about you know, the right to bear arms or something like that. You know, do you take that literally or do you take the spirit of it? You know, what do you do? Are you a fundamentalist or are you a realist? So it's very interesting, the fact that we've got a really accurate account of the first performance, which everyone ignores now completely, is kind of interesting. But it's certainly one thing that's clear is that Otello is one of these operas that's extremely patient of interpretation. It can take all sorts of different production styles in all sorts of ways, and still manages to communicate musically in such a convincing way.